Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about how we study the brain and a little bit about this term called lateralization and what that looks like. So to begin today, I'm going to tell you a fascinating story of a guy named Phineas Gage. And so you need to rewind the clock back to 1848. It's 1848 in Vermont, and Phineas Gage is in charge of a railroad company. And what they're doing is they're laying down some tracks and they come across a mountain. And if you are building a railroad and you come across a mountain, you've got a few options. You can either try to go over the mountain, you can try to go around the mountain, or most commonly what you do is you go through the mountain. And so Phineas Gage and his company was in charge of blowing up part of this mountain so that they could lay down this railroad track. And the way that it works essentially is they dig these holes into the ground. They put some blasting powder in there, some gunpowder in there, and then they walk around with this long iron rod and they pack that powder down tight. Then they stick a fuse in there, light it, and run away as fast as they can, right? So all of these holes have been drilled in the ground, and someone in the crew has gone in and they've put the blasting powder into the holes. And Phineas Gage is walking along and he's dropping this long iron rod into the hole. And we're talking like a 3 foot long iron rod. And for any of you who've ever had an iron skillet at home, you know, iron's pretty heavy, right? Well, Phineas Gage drops that iron rod down into the hole, and the iron rod hits a little rock, which causes a spark and causes an explosion. And that giant iron rod shoots up through the hole, hits underneath his left eye, goes behind his eye socket, through his frontal lobes, through the top of his head, and flies about 30 meters behind him. That should kill a person, right? Having a 3 foot long iron rod shot through your face should result in that person dying. But what's fascinating is he didn't die. He got up, walked away, went to the doctor, got all stitched up. And we tell this story over 150 years later because, first of all, pretty fascinating, he didn't die, but it actually told us a ton of information about the brain. What this told us was those frontal lobes, the part that was damaged in Phineas Gage, clearly did not deal with any of the elements of human existence that are required for survival. It didn't impact his heart rate or his breathing or anything like that. But what happened was, after the accident, Phineas Gage lived for another 12 years, but he was a completely different person. He was impulsive, he was angry, he was vulgar, he couldn't make decisions very well, he had bad judgment, he couldn't plan ahead. Here was a guy that was a manager, he was a foreman, he was in charge of a company, and he couldn't do that anymore. And so what it taught us was that front part of our brain, the frontal lobes, wasn't what kept us alive. It's what allowed us to think critically. It's what allowed us to problem solve. It's what impacts our personality. So it taught us a lot about what that part of our brain does. Now, the good news is, if we want to learn about the different parts of the brain, we don't have to shove iron rods through our faces to figure it out. Maybe 150, 160 years ago, we relied on accidents and things to better understand the brain. But today we've got some more high-tech ways to figure out what's going on with our brain, and that is primarily through brain scans. So we'll talk about 5 different brain scans and kind of what they tell us about the brain. First of all, there are a couple of different brain scans that show us structure. One type of brain scan that shows us structure is what we call a CAT scan, and a CAT scan uses X-rays to give us an idea of what's happening in the brain. You can see this image. I'll move my face over here. You can see this image on the right. Now, I'm not trained to read a CAT scan. If I was, I'd drive a faster car and live in a bigger house. But even without my training, I can look at this CAT scan and tell that there's something going wrong here. Some students may think that it's the black part. It's not the black part. That black part is actually pretty normal. Those are what we call ventricles, and it's just the space in our brain. You have them and I have them. What's going wrong with this CAT scan is this white area. And that white area is a tumor that exists in the brain. And a CAT scan allows us to see that. It's this X-ray of the brain. Another type of brain scan is what we call an MRI, and this type of brain scan, again, shows us structure. Unlike the CAT scan that uses X-rays, MRIs use magnets, And you can tell from the picture below that one big advantage to an MRI is that it is incredibly more detailed, right? And so you can see very specific structures with that MRI. You can see here's the cerebellum, there's the pons, here's the corpus callosum, here's the cerebrum up here. There's this little tiny structure, we haven't talked about that yet. That's what's called the pineal gland and pituitary gland right there in the brain. And MRIs, they show us this detail, right? This in-depth look at the brain. And you may ask yourself, well, why don't we always use MRIs then? It's clearly a better picture. Well, two big reasons is they take longer and they cost a lot more money. So CAT scans, MRIs, what do they have in common? They show us the structure of the brain. Some brain scans, on the other hand, they show us the function of the brain. So not so much a physical picture of what is happening, something that you might get if you get into an accident or have a concussion or something. Some brain scans, we want to know how is the brain operating. Well, one popular brain scan that shows function is what we call a PET scan. And the way the PET scan works is you are actually injected with this radioactive glucose, which doesn't turn you into a superhero or anything. But what it does is it allows us to register blood flow throughout the brain. And so if you are undergoing a PET scan, we might have you perform different tasks and see where your brain is really active. Again, we're looking at the function. If you look at this scan that we have on the right-hand side, it says normal, early PD, and late PD. Well, for PD, what it's talking about here is Parkinson's disease. And we can see that a normal brain, this person has a lot of activity in the basal ganglia. Maybe they're having this person put together a small jigsaw puzzle. And we can see a lot of activity with the basal ganglia. And as Parkinson's disease becomes more advanced, we see less and less activity in that basal ganglia. Think about the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. It's usually tremors and loss of fine motor control, right? Another brain scan that shows function is what we call an EEG, an electroencephalogram. And it is probably considered the least intrusive type of brain scan. Essentially, for an EEG, a person puts on this really fancy swim cap that has electrodes all over it. And what it does is it measures the electrical activity in the brain. It kind of looks like a polygraph, right? Like a lie detector test. And so there's this readout, and you can see here, this readout is showing how quickly the brain is firing for the different parts of our brain. It's measuring brain waves. And each of these lines is representing a different electrode in the EEG, on the cap there. And so we use EEGs, again, to look at brain waves. They're really popular for things like sleep studies. We haven't talked about sleep yet, but when we talk about sleep, we'll talk about how throughout the night your brain produces different types of waves. And so we can measure those brain waves through an EEG and whether or not there's perhaps increased activity when there shouldn't be. That happens when someone is having a seizure, for example. And so EEGs are really helpful to give us this immediate feedback of brain activity, showing us function. And then we have kind of the granddaddy of them all, and that's what we call an fMRI. And an fMRI shows us both structure and function. That F stands for functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. And this is like, instead of a still picture, it's a video, right? So an fMRI gives us real-time feedback of both what the brain looks like and how it is functioning. And so it's kind of this nice hybrid of the previous scans that we've been talking about. So lateralization of the brain. We talked in our last lecture about how your brain consists of two hemispheres. You have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. Your brain is lateralized, and lateral translates to next to or beside. And so when we say your brain is lateralized, and you've probably heard this before, what that means is the left side of your brain controls and interprets the right side of your body, whereas the right side of your brain controls and interprets the left side of your body. If you are right-handed and you're taking notes right now, then your left motor cortex is sending messages down motor neurons to your right hand to move, right? And so everything kind of crosses over, and that is allowed to cross over through your corpus callosum. And the sensory information that's coming in is lateralized in the thalamus. So, as visual information interprets your left visual field, things are happening over on your left side, your left visual field, that goes to your thalamus and then is sent to your right visual cortex. That's the idea of the lateralization of the brain. And later we'll talk about what happens when we sever the corpus callosum, which severs that connection, and things get really funky when that happens. We'll talk about that a little later. But as far as differences between our left hemisphere and right hemisphere, you've maybe heard this idea of a person being left-brained or right-brained, and how they have different personalities and things. And, you might have one person who's really good at math and another person who's really good at art. And I'm here to tell you that that's a myth. There is no left brain, right brain dominant people. There are elements of our brain that interprets and is in charge of certain types of functioning. But don't think that if you have a Picasso is going to just have this, really large hemisphere on one side and not the other, or something like that. Or, Einstein is going to have this really large side of his brain, but not the other side of the brain. That's just not how it works. There is no left, right brain dominant people. We do know that some elements of calculations, of understanding visual things, right? That we know that these things take place on certain hemispheres. So things that are more visually oriented, right? Completing a jigsaw puzzle, things that are spatial. There is the dominance along our right hemisphere, whereas calculations in math, understanding language, we do know that that is more likely to happen in our left hemisphere. And we can see that in brain scans. So that does exist, but don't think that Einstein has a huge left hemisphere, that Picasso has a huge right hemisphere, and that's just the way it works, right? So let's take a look just at our left hemisphere to show some of the specialization of hemisphere dominance. One thing that you need to know for AP psychology is that language is primarily located along the left hemisphere. That's real easy to remember. Just think left is language, right? Left is language. If we want to know how we interpret language, how we produce language, that is going to be taking place along our left hemisphere. And we can see this if someone damages their left hemisphere, one of the first things that can happen is their ability to speak, their ability to understand language and things like that. And it's because of these specific parts of our left hemisphere. I want to focus on just a few things here. First, I want you to look at what's labeled at number 4, what we call Broca's area. Broca's area is located kind of toward the front left temporal lobe, and Broca's area allows our mouth to move and form words, right? It's not your ability to write down something in your diary. We're literally talking about speaking out loud. It helps control speech. And so if you were to damage your Broca's area, you would have a difficult time producing words. You could write words, you just couldn't say them out loud. Your speech would sound very broken, right? Broca's area, your speech would sound very broken. And then located kind of behind our Broca's area, what's labeled as number 3 is called Wernicke's area, not Wernicke's, Wernicke's area. And it helps interpret the auditory sound. And so right now you're listening to my voice. It's that part of your brain that is decoding this sound and allowing you to interpret it and understand it, right? That's where that activity is taking place. So if you were to damage that part of your brain and I were to talk to you, you would look at me and have no idea what I was saying. You would still hear sound, but it would be gibberish. You would not be able to break those sounds into meaningful words. And the only other one that I'm going to talk about for this specific slide is what's called the angular gyrus. And that's located behind Wernicke's area. And it's the part of our brain that allows us to take some kind of visual symbol and turn it into an auditory code, which sounds weird, right? But pick any letter on this slide, right? The S, the F, it doesn't matter. Pick any letter on this slide. What's amazing is you can look at something that is visual, like the letter S, It's just something that we see, and yet we can hear it. So you see an image and it produces a sound in your mind. Think about that for a moment, right? If I just put a random visual image on the screen of random angles and shapes and things, it likely would not produce any kind of auditory perception in your mind. You wouldn't hear what you see. But some things you can hear what you see. You look at a letter and you can hear what it sounds like. That's because of your angular gyrus. The angles of that shape allows you to transform something that's visual into something that you can hear. All right. Hope that helps. We'll go over some more of this in more detail and kind of clarify questions that you may have. In the time being, if you have questions, shoot me an email. Best of luck.